Hello and welcome to What's Happening in Canada. My name is Matthew Hughes and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and we're so glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. Whether you're joining us live or viewing the recording later, we invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including our other upcoming events, and how to join the IRC as a member on our website at irckc.org. IRC members are warmly invited to join one or more IRC roundtables, a chance to connect with other members, talk about current events in regions of interest to them, and help inform IRC programming. Roundtable members are invited to a quarterly meeting and receive IRC event information and other updates relevant to the regions they select. Roundtables are open to all members of the IRC, including individual and family members, and individuals affiliated with IRC organizational members, like businesses, colleges and universities, and nonprofits. Be as involved as your schedule allows without worrying about whether you can make a meeting or meet a deadline. The point is to connect, explore, and engage. More information is online at irckc.org. With so much going on right now, it's easy to lose track of what's happening around the world, especially in places that have fallen out of the headlines or where news stories are increasingly complicated. We can't predict the future, but we do know the importance of understanding historical background and current global context. No matter your level of expertise, the What's Happening series offers meaningful explorations on some particularly active parts of the globe. We invite you to deepen your global knowledge and nuance your understanding of what's happening around the world today as we explore what's happening in Canada. We certainly welcome your thoughtful questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And do check out and share other IRC conversations as we consider a range of critical issues in the coming weeks. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator for today's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us navigate the conversation. Dr. Jack McLennan is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Park University, where he teaches international politics, comparative politics, and political theory. He also serves as Director of Park's Future Master's Program in National Security Studies. Dr. McLennan is a native of St. John, New Brunswick, Canada. He holds degrees from St. Thomas University, the University of Windsor, and the University of Michigan Dearborn, and a PhD in political science from Carleton University in Ottawa. Dr. McLennan's research interests include international relations theory, technology, security studies, and warfare. Jack, thanks so much for being with us today. Please take it away.
Thank you, Matthew, for that introduction. It's my pleasure to be here. Tonight, I have the great pleasure to introduce Dr. Roy Norton, who's Adjunct Assistant Professor at the University of Waterloo's Balsillie School of International Affairs. Prior to his tenure at Balsillie, Dr. Norton was in the Canadian Foreign Service, where he was posted 4 times to the United States, twice to Canada's Embassy in Washington, also then serving as Consul General at Detroit and as Consul General at Chicago. From 2016 to 2019, Dr. Norton was Canada's Chief of Protocol based at Global Affairs in Ottawa. Before serving in that role, Dr. Norton's experience ranges from various foreign policy and economic development roles in the government of Ontario, in the House of Commons and Senate of Canada, as well as serving as Senior Policy Advisor to Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Dr. Norton's PhD is from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He also holds master's degrees from that same institution, from the Harvard Kennedy School, and he's a fellow Carleton alum. Currently, he is a fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, a global fellow of the Canadian Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., a lieutenant of the Royal Victorian Order, a voluntary presiding officer at Canadian citizenship ceremonies, and one of 3 Canadian members on the international authority overseeing the implementation of the Canada-Michigan Agreement to build the Gordie Howe International Bridge between Detroit and Windsor. His publications and research interests focus mostly on Canadian foreign policy, in particular on Canada's relations with the United States. Thank you very much for being with us, Dr. Norton, and take it away.
Dr. McLennan, thank you very much, and thank you to the National Relations Council of Kansas City. When I was Consul General of Canada to Missouri, Illinois, and Wisconsin, I spent a lot of time in Missouri and especially enjoyed my time in Kansas City. It's good of you to invite me back, so to speak. I should stress at the outset that given that I am a former Canadian diplomat, retired from the government 3 years ago, I do not speak for the government of Canada, and so any misstatements are truly my own, and the government of Canada should not be held responsible for them. Let's dive into a few slides, and then we'll turn Dr. McLennan to your questions and to those from the audience, to which I very much look forward. Canada is headed by a Liberal government. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is in his third mandate, having been elected first in 2015. The chart on the left shows that in 2021, September, his last election victory, he won a minority government with almost 47% of the seats. He relies to sustain his government in office on the New Democratic Party, the Social Democratic Party. He won that mandate with 32% of the popular vote, which may seem to some like a small share, but we have a multi-party parliamentary system, and that's the sort of thing that can happen when you have several parties contesting the election. The chart on the right shows current polling and indicates that the Liberals are slightly behind the opposition, the official opposition Conservative Party, which selected a new leader in September, just 2 months ago, and they're enjoying a little bit of a boost from that, I think it's fair to say. As well, Canadians, like Americans and folks in lots of other countries, are facing some economic challenges right now, and there's a little bit of blowback against the government for that reason alone. Some tombstone data, so to speak. We're a little bit bigger, but just a tad bigger than the United States in terms of geography. But our population is much smaller. You'd have to multiply it by 9.5 to get to the US population of 332 million. Still, we take more than 400,000 legal immigrants, emphasis on legal. It's not very easy to get to Canada as an illegal immigrant per year, which compares to your 740,000, but again, we're a much smaller population base. Essentially, we take 1% of our population each year in new immigration, and the government today announced that they propose to increase that to 500,000 per year by 2025. You had asked about our Indigenous population, which is, in fact, 2021 census data has come out since I prepared this on the weekend, and it would seem to be closer to 6.2% of our total population is Indigenous, so 3 times the proportion in the United States. And I include this number about population of Ukrainian origin in light of world events at the moment. Fully 3.8% of Canadians identify as being of Ukrainian origin. We are the 3rd largest Ukrainian population in the world after Ukraine and Russia, which speaks, at least in part, to why the Canadian government is as rigorous and as thorough as the US government is in contributing to Ukraine's efforts to beat back this Russian invasion. In terms of economic data, our inflation rate is a little bit lower than yours and coming down, but slowly, and it's obviously much higher than most Canadians had been accustomed to. Our unemployment rate is a little bit higher. It's always about 1% higher than the US rate because we calculate it differently, but it goes beyond that range right now. Our growth rate is a little bit higher than yours, but we don't have our 3rd quarter data in yet. That will come soon, and my guess is we might be closer to your 2.6% when that does materialize. Federal deficit pretty much in the same ballpark as yours. Federal debt, much less. We're a much less indebted country at the federal government level, but an important caveat to that, our provinces cumulatively spend more than our federal government does in any given year, whereas US states spend only 42% annually of what the US federal government spends. And since provinces are allowed to run deficits and hence debts, our debt load is not far off what it is the United States is. Interest rate and fixed 30-year mortgage rate in the same ballpark as the U.S., and that speaks to the affordability challenge, some might say crisis, that Canadians are facing right now, as Americans are. Trade is extremely important to us. We are one another's most important trading partners, biggest trading partners. For the U.S., it's Canada, then China, then Mexico, but those can flip in any given year. However, we're much more dependent on you than you are on us. Almost 3/4 of Canadian exports are sold to the US, whereas 1/5 of all US exports to the world are sold to Canada. We're more dependent on trade than you, and that's a function, I would say, of the fact that our domestic market is obviously much smaller than yours. In terms of Missouri, our total two-way trade is about $11 billion a year. Half of our exports to you, of $6 billion, half of that is in petroleum. And indeed, we supply to the United States about 20% of all of the oil that the United States consumes in any given year. And I'm guessing, and we're certainly happy to be able to do that, and I'm guessing that Americans are relieved that where we are and that you can buy it from us, and that you're not having to compete with Europeans and Japanese and others right now for oil in the tightened market as a result of the Russian invasion and the sanctions that have been applied. About 40% of Missouri's exports to Canada consist of trucks. And when you reflect on where trucks are made in Missouri, you'd have to fix upon the Ford plant in the suburbs of Kansas City, which makes the F-150, and a lot of those find their way to Canada. Foreign direct investment is vitally important in both directions. We have a smaller capital formation capability than the United States for obvious reasons, but nonetheless, we invest hugely in the United States. And in the case of Missouri, about 200 Canadian businesses employ more than 13,000 workers in the state. This graph is included to illustrate the extent to which we make things together. That's a term that we use. Look at the motor vehicles bar there. What that tells you is that fully half of the content of any car on average that we sell to the United States, and we sell lots of them, consists in the first instance of content purchased from the United States and then incorporated into the final product and sold back into the US. We have what we call resilient and what everybody would call highly integrated supply chains. This map is designed to show the states, there are more than 30 of them, that have Canada as their principal export destination. That includes Missouri, and literally millions of jobs in the United States depend on those exports to Canada. The USMCA, we call it CUSMA, recently renewed. It's the successor to NAFTA. It's the foundational trade agreement between our two countries, and indeed with Mexico as well. Because of our propensity to trade, like you, we have a lot of one-off trade agreements with smaller countries, but Canada also has a free trade agreement with the EU. We are part of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which, of course, the United States had been part of, but President Trump withdrew the US early in his term. And we're negotiating free trade agreements with ASEAN, Indonesia, a replacement with the UK for the fact that they withdrew from the EU. That probably would be done by now if they had a government for more than 5 minutes, but we're hopeful that it'll get done very soon. And as of last week, when U.S. Secretary of State Blinken visited Canada, we've agreed to join the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which isn't a free trade agreement per se. What it is more of a standards setting arrangement. But what's critically important in its case is that India is part of it. Some more data points that could spark some questions, I would think. In terms of healthcare spending, we spend considerably less as a proportion of GDP than what the US does, yet a higher percentage of our population is vaccinated against COVID. And per million population, considerably fewer Canadians have succumbed to COVID in terms of fatalities. You had asked Dr. McLennan about foreign aid, about official development assistance, and indeed we are a major contributor, less generous than some. We compare favorably in that regard to the United States. Not so much on defense spending, however, where our spending as a proportion of GDP is less than half of what the United States spends. GHG emissions, climate change is important to Canadians. Polling consistently substantiates that. We are committed, our government is, to major reductions in emissions by 2030 and beyond. It's going to take a real effort to get there. The government has introduced a few years ago a progressively increasing carbon tax, which doesn't find favor with everyone, but has been found legal by the Supreme Court. And it's revenue neutral in the sense that it's rebated. It's trying to change behavior, but it's not trying to raise additional incremental revenues for the government. Where you're second in terms of emissions, the US is, we're 11th in the world. And we actually emit a little bit more per capita than what Americans do, probably a function of the fact that we're colder and need to use more energy to heat in the winter, and our distances and smaller population mean that people oftentimes travel longer distances to get to work, for example. I threw the next number in because it's kind of counterintuitive. In the 2020 US federal election and the 2021 Canadian federal election, voter turnout was identical. 62% in both countries. Confidence in the US president is high in Canada, 60%, 62% in fact. I dare say President Biden would welcome that approval rating in the United States. It's not always so high. It was only 20% in the latter part of President Trump's presidency. And we were delighted when Gallup revealed, US Gallup revealed earlier this year that we sort of topped the hit parade in terms of favorability ratings of foreign countries by Americans at 94%. You asked about our constitutional future in light of the passing of Queen Elizabeth. Well, we now have a King of Canada, Charles III. He is less popular, hardly any great newsworthiness to that than his mother. And the majority of Canadians now favor severing the relationship to the monarchy. Easier said than done. There was a vote in the House of Commons last week. It was symbolic and it failed overwhelmingly, which might indicate something. But our Constitution is at the level of amendment that would be required in this case, close to unamendable. A lot of unanimity would be required, and you shouldn't anticipate Canada severing its relationship with the monarchy anytime soon as a result. You had asked as well about Quebec independence and how strong that movement is. It's less than 10 years ago that the Parti Québécois, the separatist party, and it was the government in Quebec. They were there from 2012 to 2014, and they had won that election with 32% of the vote. Their share has successively fallen in the 3 elections since, and in the election in September, just 2 months ago, it was only 15%, which isn't to say that separatism is dead, but it's certainly parked and not a pronounced force at the moment. Evan Verplo of the council had told me that you've had recent sessions with focusing on Venezuela, on Yemen, on Iran, and other countries of that sort. We're not like any of those countries. We are joined at the hip with the United States. The United States is truly our closest ally and best friend. We're both members of the G7 and of the G20. We collaborate very closely with the United States in the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, in the Organization of the American States, in the Arctic Council. Our militaries are totally integratable. They use the same sorts of equipment. They train together. We're founding members of NATO in 1948. Our most important defense arrangement is with the United States in the context of NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, protecting North American airspace against foreign intrusion. And the two of us, along with the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand, are part of the Five Eyes, which means that we trust one another to share all intelligence, all sensitive intelligence with one another. Our leaders visit one another. President Obama came here in June of 2016 and spoke to Parliament. President Trump came here for the G7 summit that we hosted in 2018. President Biden hasn't yet been here as president, but that's apparently under discussion. He did come in his last weeks as vice president. The prime minister hosted him on that occasion. And the picture in the bottom right is of the president and the prime minister just this June in Los Angeles at the Summit of the Americas. Bottom line, they get together a lot. They talk all the time on the telephone and virtually, and they meet not just at the White House, or Los Angeles, as the case might be, but at all of these summits that we're both part of. We invest a lot as a government in getting to know American decision makers and influencers. The picture on the left is me speaking to the Missouri House of Representatives in Jefferson City when I was Consul General. I spoke to the Senate as well. The then governor of the state, Jay Nixon, came to Toronto and Ottawa. That picture is of him with the then Ontario Premier Kathleen Wynne. I took him on another occasion to Alberta. And just last week, Secretary of State Blinken was in Ottawa and Montreal visiting with our Foreign Minister, Melanie Joly, talking about current vitally important issues like Ukraine, like Iran, like Haiti, like the Indo-Pacific, and the roadmap for a renewed U.S.-Canada partnership, which is the framework that President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau evolved when they had their first summit, which was in February of 2021. Arguably, the most important issue between us, and that doesn't suggest conflict, has to do now with critical minerals. I think both governments have recognized that neither of our populations are well served by continued disproportionate reliance on China for critical minerals that are going to be necessary to build batteries and facilitate the move to electric vehicles and other green energy. We have a geology that permits the development of some of those, like cobalt and graphite and nickel and lithium and some rare earths. But there had been a little bit of a hiccup in your Build Back Better Act that discriminated. It applied so-called Buy American provisions against vehicles, for example, that came from Canada using such minerals developed in Canada. You thought better of that in the context of the Inflation Reduction Act, and so all is now good, and it hopefully suggests a greater recognition that we really are in this together and we need to collaborate very closely. Finally, in terms of what's happening at this moment in Canada, When this ends, I'm going to be watching the third game of the World Series, which unfortunately neither of our teams are in, but we can hope that next year brings a better outcome. And with that, Dr. McLennan, I'm going to turn this back to you and try to answer any questions that you might have, and then take those from the audience.
All right, thank you. Well, I will say that my Toronto Maple Leafs are on pace to disappoint me. They usually do. So we'll just shove a little Canadian content in there. Again, I just remind all of you to take the opportunity to answer questions or ask questions at the bottom of your screen. I already have a couple. I'll try to integrate those where I can. And then ones that I can't, I'll turn to individually toward the end of the session. So if I don't answer you right away, doesn't mean I didn't see it. So Roy, I have a few questions based on your presentation that maybe you can elaborate on and help us a little bit. One of the things was, I think that chart of where public polling is in Canada, the fact that there's a separatist party that actually, polls enough to be in the federal legislature. We talk about some Canadian trivia about how the Bloc actually formed the official opposition at one time. That illustrates a certain effect that we've seen in Canadian federal politics for the last several election cycles, which is that the Canadian Conservative Party has managed to keep its vote share, right? It's managed to win in the last two elections a plurality of votes, but hasn't been able to form a government. What effects have that had on Canadian politics? This idea that the party that usually wins the plurality, not the majority, but the plurality doesn't end up forming government.
Well, the profound change happened at the end of the Mulroney government, 1984 to 1993, when the Conservative Party, the Progressive Conservative Party, as it was actually then called, splintered, and a Western protest party, which was called Reform, grew out of the embers of the Progressive Conservative Party, as did this nationalist party in Quebec called the Bloc Québécois, the federal equivalent of the Parti Québécois. And since that time, the Conservative Party has not won 40%, let alone 50% in a national election. Certainly, the hope of the new leader, Pierre Poilievre, chosen in September, is that he can rebuild elements of the coalition. Yes, they have dominated in the sense that they've secured more popular vote than the Liberals in the last two federal elections. There's a lot of so-called wasted vote. They run up huge majorities of 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 in an electoral district of 125,000 voters in Western Canada. And they lose districts in Ontario by 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000. The Liberals have done a much better job of getting out their vote, it would seem. The interesting thing about the most recent leadership selection, however, is that Pierre Poilievre did not strive to be a centrist in any way. His predecessor, Aaron O'Toole, styled himself a centrist and wanted to bring all wings together. Poilievre is a much more conservative in the U.S. libertarian sense almost leader, and is pretty unapologetic about the views that he holds to. The centrist candidate was a former premier of Quebec, former leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, Jean Charest. He got only 16% of the vote in that leadership. He was second at 60%. Poilievre swept the floor with 67%. And so the party seems to be pretty much unified behind Poilievre. Whether that will work in a general election, there was a poll today, for example, that showed that Canadians, 31% of Canadians totally distrust Prime Minister Trudeau, and 22% totally distrust Pierre Poilievre, who's only been leader for 7 weeks. when Aaron O'Toole left office, was driven from office by caucus, his unpopularity rating was 27%. So it's hard to extrapolate from that certainty about what the next election will yield. I think it's safe to say.
Thank you. My next question, I had this written down, but I'm gonna try to work in a question from one of the audience members. And one of the audience members was remarking about your discussion about the interrelationship between the Canadian and U.S. militaries, and how that works. And for those of us in this line of work, we tend to refer to Canada as what we call a middle power. And the short explanation of that to those of you in the seminar is middle powers tend to exercise more clout than smaller powers, but they do that by being very specific in the kinds of issues that they take up and expend capital on, and the kinds of technological skill sets they bring to larger sort of international endeavors like defense organizations like NATO. Could you talk maybe a little bit about how being a middle power is shaping Canada's place in the world right now from where you're sitting?
Well, on integration, we have several hundred members of our armed forces military integrated literally in the Pentagon at any given time. And as I said, they do train together. In NATO, we lead the battle group in Latvia, Operation Reassurance. The United States was very enthusiastic that we undertook to do that. The Prime Minister has been a couple of times. I was there once with him to the Adazi base just east of Riga in Latvia, which is only 30 miles from the Russian border. And we have a force in the high hundreds leading about 10 or 11 other NATO countries. We had a very large allocation in Afghanistan for more than a decade, and lost about 160 members of the armed forces over the course of our time there. And we did that in close collaboration with the U.S. We're involved in military training in Iraq, again, something that the U.S. strongly endorses and encourages. We're spending an increasing percentage of our GDP on defense, not as much as the U.S. would like us to, but it's increasing, and we've just committed to buy 88 F-35s made by Lockheed Martin. We have signed an agreement with the United States to massively upgrade radar and other defense systems in the Arctic under NORAD. We are committed to contributing more UN peacekeepers, something the United States would like us to do. So these are you pick your, precisely consistent with what you said, Dr. McLennan, you pick your areas where your contribution is likely to stand out. There are things that the U.S. Can't do everything, doesn't want to do everything, shouldn't be expected to do everything. And so it's an exercise in burden sharing, and we are committed, and we're working out with the Americans and with other NATO partners where we can contribute most, I think it's safe to say.
All right, thank you so much. My next one, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to talk about how I had noted this in your presentation, and then I have a question that I think is germane that I'll give you them both at the same time. So you pointed out that 60% of U.S. Canadian exports come to the United States, right?
75%, 73.5%.
Sorry. How has that relationship, right, that sort of that important integration been affected by, as you noted quickly, a move over the last two presidential administrations in the United States to thinking more about buying American and sort of onshoring supply chains? You briefly mentioned some things about how that's impacted the relationship between Ottawa and Washington. Could you give us a better sense maybe about some of how that the last few years have sort of gone from the perspective of north of the border?
We have our share of trade irritants in the United States, as almost every trading partner does. and some of those are very long-standing. Softwood lumber is one of those dates from the early 1980s. Cool country of origin labeling in the meatpacking sector is another one. President Trump took this to a new level by introducing something called Section 232 tariffs, national security tariffs against the imports of Canadian steel and aluminum. And that threw Canadians for a loop in the sense that we're unaccustomed to being considered a national security threat to the United States. And you don't produce enough domestic aluminum anyway. And so it didn't seem to make any sense at all. This was not targeted exclusively against Canada, but we were caught in the loop, as it were, and that went away only after we retaliated. We introduced tariffs on, as we're allowed to do, against a number of targeted U.S. exports to Canada, and after a year, essentially, you tried both, and we agreed that those tariffs would be, Section 232 tariffs would be withdrawn. The renegotiation of NAFTA was a struggle. President Trump had threatened, of course, to rip it up, which would have fundamentally altered the continental trading arrangements that had evolved since NAFTA went into effect in 1994. U.S. business wasn't keen on that either. And so we had a lot of allies in the United States, and there were lots of folks in Congress who were strong allies in favor of upgrading NAFTA. It probably could have been upgraded even more in the sense that there were things like labor mobility that should probably have been updated to reflect changes in the 25 years since it had gone into effect. But that's a sensitive issue for the United States, and so we didn't go there. But generally, we work things out. The Canadian business community is very much focused on doing business in the United States, just as the U.S. business community is on doing business in Canada. It's a relatively easy proposition. You know, we speak the same language for the most part. There's some French Canadian businesses that may have a little bit of a struggle, but same legal systems. We do business the same way, and it's one of the reasons, frankly, that notwithstanding efforts by Canadian governments to diversify our export profile, Canadian businesses, particularly small and medium-sized ones, keep looking in the first instance to the United States as their preferred place to do business, and so the numbers don't change very much.
Great. What I did want to say is whether or not you see that. So that was a great way of talking about integration. I did have a specific question about, and if this isn't something you have right in hand, I understand, but about the recent acquisition of KC Southern Railway by Canadian Pacific, and what those kinds of business deals mean for the Canadian economy.
Well, it's very important. A lot of North American trade is essentially north-south in terms of natural movements. Goods arrive from across the Pacific, not just from China. They arrive at the port of Vancouver. Canadian Pacific can pick them up and bring them right into the heartland of the United States. And our port is a little bit less congested than the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles, at least that was the case a year ago, or of Seattle, Washington. And so it contributes to the integration. I don't have a horse in the race. Of course, the U.S. regulatory authorities have yet to approve Canadian Pacific's bid for Canadian the Kansas City Southern Railway, but it looks like a very sensible deal in terms of consolidation. It's not as if the two biggest railways on the continent are forming an alliance, and so on its face, it should not diminish competition very much. Canadian National backed out, having been essentially knocked out of the race. I used to deal with Keith Crea, the then president of CP, when I was Consul General based in Chicago. I thought that he was a fine, upstanding person who really seemed committed to achieving greater integration. It wasn't just about profitability for his company, so I was personally rather encouraged when that bid went forward.
Great, thank you so much. The next thing that I had a few other ones, but I think I'm going to pick some questions, the tree here, and add a little bit of color to them. So you talked a little bit about Canada's pretty substantial Ukrainian population, especially Western Canada, and it's translated to a very clear sort of position on the war in Ukraine. But one other person remarked that Canada, especially in Western Canada, and in large cities like Toronto, have fairly high levels of immigration from Asia, right? There are a lot of Asian Canadians. And I know for a fact that our relationship with China has been slightly fraught over the last few years. Could you maybe give us a little bit of a sense of where Canada sits as a middle power that sort of has two neighbors, one very close and one a bit further away, that it has to try to manage relationships with, and that's the United States and China?
Well, they're not in the same order of magnitude at all. Again, the United States is a friend, ally, partner, and China is a place that we do a lot of business with, but that we're mindful plays the game differently. China took two Canadian business people hostage, essentially, after we obliged the United States' request to detain the daughter of the president of Huawei, who holds a leadership role in the company herself. And this went on for 1,000 days. And the U.S. was instrumental in extricating them. But Canadians are increasingly apprehensive, I think, about the way in which China does business, especially Chinese state-owned companies. Nobody has a lot of confidence that they act independently of the Chinese government. There are concerns about repatriating profits. There are concerns about loss of intellectual property, so on and so forth. There's a will to continue to cooperate with China, certainly on something like climate change, for example, as there is in the United States. But China is not about to replace the United States in my lifetime as the principal economic partner of Canada. And again, apprehensions are growing, I think, about Chinese ambitions, Chinese behaviors on the human rights front. And so there's an inclination, we'll see there's an Indo-Pacific strategy that our government has promised. Yours came out a year ago. We're anticipating ours imminently. And we'll see where that shakes out. But I don't expect it will declare animus towards China. Although the framework that I mentioned, the framework agreement between Canada and the United States, a renewed partnership dating from February of 2021, had pretty stark language on China, as in the two governments, Canada and the United States, signed on to calling the government of China's behavior coercive, for example, not something you would say about a friend.
I have another, I think, really interesting and topical question that I'm going to field for you. And this person has been keeping up with their Canadian news. They know that Canada is having several big conversations about where we are as a country and what that means. One of them has to do with the monarchy that you touched on really quickly. But the other one is the relationship with First Nations, right? Especially the ongoing Truth and Reconciliation Commission work and some of the revelations that have come out over the last few years, creating a sort of big popular debate. And the specific question was, how have relations with First Nations been lately? And what could the U.S. draw from that experience Canada is having in thinking about its own history and current dealings with Indigenous people?
It's a flawed area. You're absolutely right, and so is the questioner. We're getting better. We're getting more sensitive, more alert to reality. There have been apologies extended to, for example, for so-called residential schools that were created 100 years ago now and ended in the late 1990s, where children were taken from reservations with the objective essentially of assimilating them into white society. The government spends a lot of resources. You mentioned in your questions to me, you referenced Nunavut. Nunavut is our territory in the Northeast. It's almost 12 times the size of Missouri, and it has almost 40,000 people living in it. So imagine trying to provide high quality education, high quality medical services to a community of 40,000 people spread across a territory 12 times the size of Missouri. But we try. We're committed. And there's much more consultation with Indigenous communities that would be affected from resource development, for example. Vetoes haven't been extended, but unquestionably, there's more effort to include Indigenous businesses in resource developments, for example, to ensure that there's the full opportunity to profit from such developments, and to ensure along the way that they're more environmentally sensitive and more attuned to the impact on the land. The land being the thing that Indigenous people care most about, as in the link to the land is I think what truly defines Indigenous persons relative to some of the rest of us who should care a lot more about the land than we do. What lessons Americans would take from that, Dr. McLennan, that's for your listenership to conclude. I'm not in the business of offering lessons to Americans.
All right. So the last thing I have for you, maybe to comment upon, is there's one question in the chat that I'm again sort of going to build out a little bit and ask you to reflect. And I'm going to get you to reach back into your background and get your pitch ready. So the question was about whether or not there's discussions of Canada, who has sort of vast reserves of fresh water, might be in a position to provide that to the United States. I'd have to point out that would have to be in the long run because there's no infrastructure to do that right now. But I'm going to spin that out and say, at a time of sort of where we're getting to sort of experience and see more of the effects of climate change, how can the United States, the U.S.-Canada relationship really serve to help both of us become more resilient and effective? What resources can Canada bring into bear? What things can it do, and how can the relationship sort of strengthen our positions?
Well, I actually had a conversation the other day with somebody who asked me what I thought could be the most fraught issue going forward, not necessarily starting tomorrow, but maybe starting in a few years' time with the U.S. And I said water, because I mean, it's obvious that populations in the U.S. Southwest are increasingly starved for water. And I can easily imagine some folks looking covetously upon the Great Lakes and saying we should, build pipelines of water. As things currently stand, water cannot be exported from the Great Lakes. In fact, it can't be used beyond the existing Great Lakes watershed. You can't move water further than Waukesha, Wisconsin, which is about 30 miles from the Lake Michigan coast. And Canadians will hold quite strongly to that view. You drain Lake Michigan, you drain all the Great Lakes. And I'm projecting that maybe Minnesota and Michigan will become favored locations to live going forward, rather more than Florida and Nevada. But maybe I'm being naive in that regard. In terms of resources generally, I did touch upon critical minerals, where collectively we have what it takes. The extraction isn't so much the issue. The processing of those is. It's not a very clean process right now. It will get better for sure. Canada, more than half of the publicly traded mining companies in the world are headquartered in Canada. More than $500 billion worth of global investment. We know something about mining, and we think that we're more likely than a lot of other jurisdictions to be able to impel our companies to constantly improve their technologies so as to do less environmental damage. But to mitigate climate change, we're going to need these minerals, and that will become an existential priority. And collectively, we're going to have to place a thumb on the scale, I would guess, in favor of development and processing of the resources in order to mitigate, to the extent to which we can, further deterioration of the global climate.
So one spin-off of that, which I think is a really important question for an audience like ours who's sort of in the US heartland. Can you give us a sense of what climate change, what effects it's having on the Canadian Arctic, and not just the implications of that on the environment, but on things like commerce and regional security and Indigenous populations and other areas? So that these effects of climate change in the Arctic and how they're affecting those things.
Well, the Canadian Arctic is warming faster than Missouri or Ontario. And so Indigenous populations who rely on various sources of food are challenged. Permafrost is the basis for a lot of construction. It's melting, and so homes and buildings risk sinking. The Northwest Passage, which actually would shorten considerably the distance, transit distance from China, for example, to the U.S. East Coast, much shorter than through the Panama Canal, for example, is melting, and it becomes a much more realistic way of moving goods than previously. But that invites, for example, the Chinese military to be showing without icebreaking capability an increased presence potentially in the Arctic, which we're going to have to control between us to ensure that that no advantage is gained there. So really big impacts on the population. Population isn't large, as I said. In Nunavut, it's less than 40,000 people, but these are people that have, generations of people have lived there, and their lives are being upended, and it's a real challenge for them, just as it's a challenge for people in South Florida having to deal with 100-year hurricanes that they hadn't ever experienced in their lifetime.
All right. Well, Dr. Norton, thank you so much. I'll give you one last chance. Is there anything that you think you'd be remiss for not mentioning as a note of closing?
Well, I'm surprised you didn't raise the so-called Freedom Convoy, which you indicated you might. And maybe I should have just left that go. But since you did raise it, Dr. McLennan, there's an inquiry headed by a senior Canadian justice underway right now on the issue of whether Canada should have the Emergencies Act, as we did. It's the first time that it's ever been used to end that convoy. And as I was thinking about it, it occurred to me that there's a distinction that can perhaps be made between occupation and protest. Protest is entirely legitimate, and we're a pretty law-abiding people. Indeed, just as the U.S. rallying cry is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, ours has been peace, order, and good government, which tells you something about a difference in psychological approach between our two populations. But the people who came and occupied Ottawa for 3 weeks, initially it had been assumed that they were coming to protest for a few days and that they would leave, which is the way things have always gone down in the past. That's not what happened this time. They stayed, and that had a real impact on Ottawa is a city of 1 million, and the people who came are testifying today even, saying, no, this wasn't about insurrection. This was to protest border restrictions having to do with a vaccine mandate. In other words, they were protesting U.S. vaccine requirements. These are truckers who weren't allowed to go to the United States because of this requirement. Think about that for a second. Closing down, imagine people closing down the core of Kansas City for 3 weeks because they didn't like something the Canadian government was doing. I mean, it would seem pretty absurd. And then we had at the Ambassador Bridge, I showed you a slide on integration, just-in-time delivery. Your government of the United States intervened pretty strenuously, saying, you've got to do something because automotive plants in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana literally closed down for days because they rely on parts that are essentially inventoried in the trucks that come across a bridge that was blockaded for a week. And our reputation as a reliable supplier was compromised. So something needed to be done. Something was done, and there'll be conclusions of this inquiry as to whether it was overreach or overstepping or whatever. But there were people in Ottawa who I come from Ottawa originally, who older people who couldn't get to cancer treatments. They couldn't get out to buy groceries. Ottawa is cold and snowy in February. The taxi couldn't get near their place because they were blockaded, essentially. Ultimately, the line was likely crossed between protest and occupation. The government decided something needed to be done. Your government seemed to be immensely relieved in the case of the Ambassador Bridge at Windsor-Detroit that we took action to do something. Our inquiry will decide whether that was justified or not. But and there's a difference of opinion in Canada, to be sure, but overwhelmingly Canadians felt that when the protest transited into occupation, something needed to be done. So I throw that in.
Thank you so much, because it was well covered down here. So it's great to get that perspective.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for your time this evening. Dr. Norton, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Right now, I'm going to cede my responsibilities back to Matthew Hughes and say thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. And I will take my leave, which is, I assume, what I'm supposed to do now.
Dr. Norton and Dr. McLennan, thank you so much for this conversation. As we were mentioning earlier, there are so many things going on with our neighbors to the north and south that we don't necessarily think about all the time here in Kansas City, but I think it's important. And as I think many in our audience will know, Kansas City was selected as one of about a little over a dozen World Cup sites in 2026, and we're looking forward to sharing that mantle with Canada and Mexico and other sites around the U.S. So definitely lots of reasons to keep paying attention to what's happening up north. Dr. Norton, thank you again. And everyone, thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again at an upcoming IRC program. Check us out online at irckc.org. Thanks so much.